welcome back to another episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th edition. As always, my name is Jay, and this part we'll be going over the characteristic profile of the miniatures in the game Warhammer 40K. Now, after my last video, I got several contacts messages about how I forgot to mention what the profile stat line means, and that it's very important when deciding how you want to build your army. So today's episode is going to be about just that. As you'll notice, beside everyone's name, there's a stat line, a characteristic profile, if you will, and it has a bunch of letters that may not mean anything to you, and a bunch of numbers which may not mean anything to you, and that's what this episode will clarify. So I'm going to be going over each number and each letter, and talking about the average value, what's a good value, what's a not so good value, and what each value is used for in the game of Warhammer 40K. And also we'll be going over modifiers after this video, discussing how modifiers can affect the value of your particular model or squad in the game of Warhammer 40K 7th edition. And just to let you guys know, pretty much all of these values range between the values of 0 and 10. The higher, the better, and the lower, the worse. And we'll be going over the average values of each one in this video. So, let's get started, shall we? So the first part of your profile is WS, or Weapon Skill, as it's typically called. And this value represents how good your model is in close combat in the game of Warhammer 40K. An average value is 4. For example, this Space Marine Tactical Marine, his value is 4, which means he's pretty good at close combat. Obviously, the higher the value, the better, but you'll learn that the more you play Warhammer 40K, the weapon skill is a little bit arbitrary. And as I mentioned, the value for weapon skill ranges between 0 and 10, 10 being the best, 0 being the worst. Average value, about 4. Up next, we have the Ballistic Skill, or BS, as it's called, value in the characteristic profile. And this value actually represents how good your guy is at shooting. Therefore, it's typically used in the shooting phase of the game, or sometimes the psychic phase if your psychic power is a shooting power. And once again, this value ranges between 0 and 10, and a good average value for this is 4. Once again, we'll use our Tactical Marine as an example, and his Ballistic Skill is also 4. Since he's kind of the jack of all trades, he's kind of good at everything. However, this Orc Boy, his Ballistic Skill is 2, meaning that he is not very good at shooting and relies mostly on luck for hitting his opponent, versus the Space Marine, which will hit most of the time. The next value is S, which stands for Strength. This value represents how strong your model is, and it's typically used once again in close combat. After you've hit your opponent, you use the value of Strength, plus any modifiers from the weapon, to figure out what you need to wound your opponent in close combat. There are some things as strength tests, which you have to roll equal to or under your strength, but typically your strength is only used in the assault phase of Warhammer 40K 7th edition. This value is also the most frequently modified by weapons, such as this big choppa on this knob adds +2 to the strength profile of your guy. So he goes from strength 4 to strength 6. Also, one of the heavy hitting weapons in close combat in this game is the Power Claw or Power Fist, and it is strength times 2. So you just multiply it by 2. So it goes from strength 4 to strength 8. Very good in close combat. Once again, the higher the value, the better. Ranges between 0 and 10, and an average value of this is 4. Typically, the bigger, the stronger monsters will have higher than 4, and the smaller, the weaker creatures will have lower than 4. And a good average person will have equal to 4, such as this Tactical Marine, and the Orc actually has a strength equal to 3. So he's slightly weaker than a Space Marine for some reason. The next value that you need to know is the Toughness value, which is represented by the letter T. T for Toughness. And this value represents how hard it is to wound your model in close combat or from the shooting phase. This value is typically used in your opponent's shooting phase when he's shooting at you, or the assault phase, where your opponent is trying to wound you with a close combat weapon, such as stabbing you with a knife. And as I mentioned, values between 0 and 10. The lower, the worse, and the lower it is, the easier it is to wound your guy. And the higher the better. Once again, a good average value is equal to 4. And such as Space Marine has a value equal to 4, and this Orc Boy has a value equal to 4. So it's a good, solid value. Higher the better. So you get monster creatures such as this Wraith Knight right here for the Elder Army. His toughness value is 8, meaning he's very hard to wound in close combat or by shooting. So you may want to reconsider what you're using against him when shooting at him or in close combat. So the next value that you might want to think about is wounds, represented by the letter W. Wounds basically represents how many lives does your model have in the game Warhammer 40K. And once he suffers an unsaved wound, he loses a wound. So if he starts at 1 wound and he loses a wound, he goes down to 0 and is dead. Some armies like Necrons can get right back up again, some can be resurrected, but typically it means that the model will be removed from play and will be no longer part of your army in the game of Warhammer 40K for this particular game. Now, unlike the other values, it once again does range from 0 to 10, but an average value for wounds is actually just 1. Most models in Warhammer 40K have 1 wound, especially for troops. You'll only find that HQs, some elite, and probably most likely the heavy support have more than 1 wound, ranging from some can get as high as 6 wounds, 7 wounds, and under some circumstances even 10 wounds. But typically, a normal model has 1 wound, an elite model has 2, and heavy supports typically range between 4 and 6. Obviously the more wounds the better, but there are some rules that will negate the number of rules, and that will be covered in a future video. The next value is initiative, represented by the letter I. I for initiative. An initiative represents how quick your guy is with a weapon in close combat. Basically, the higher the initiative, the faster he will strike in close combat, and the more likely he will hit his opponent before his opponent hits him back. And a good solid value for initiative is once again 4. Some armies like Eldar have preferably higher than 4, such as 5 and above, as do Dark Eldar. Some armies like Orcs and Necrons have much lower. Their typical initiative is 2, maybe 3. So they're much slower in close combat. Once again, you typically use initiative in close combat because it's, unless you're forced to take an initiative test where you have to roll equal to or under, you basically only use initiative in the assault phase of Warhammer 40K. The next value in your characteristic profile is attacks, represented by the letter A. A for attacks. Now this value represents the number of attacks you get in close combat with your model. So obviously the higher the number, the more attacks you get in close combat. And typically an average value for number of attacks, once again, does range between 0 and 10, but the most typical average number of attacks is between 1 and 3. Most troops have 1, some elites have 1 or 2, and heavy support can go as high as 6, 7, even 8 attacks. And some weapons will even get you as high as 10 attacks. But that's pretty rare. So typical, a good number of attacks is between 2 and 3. A normal troop will have 1 or 2. So that just represents the number of attacks used, and once again, the number of attacks is typically used in the assault phase of Warhammer 40K, not typically the shooting. The next value, leadership. Leadership represents how easily does your model get spooked on the battlefield if he loses his fellow troops, or how strong is he at leading his fellow troops. And this value once again ranges between 0 and 10, but in this case, a good average value is about 8, represented by this Tactical Marine. This Tactical Marine has a leadership value of 8. An Orc Boy, such as this one, has a leadership value of 7, meaning he is more easily spooked on the battlefield. Once he loses 25% of his comrades, he's more likely to run away in fear. And that's basically leadership. The higher the leadership, the better, and some armies have a rule called Fearless, which kind of ignores leadership tests and makes them super awesome on the battlefield. And the final value in this character's profile is the armor save. Now, unlike the other values, the lower this value, the better, because it represents the minimal number on a dice, a 6-sided dice, or D6 is typically called, you need to roll to save your guy if a wound is inflicted. So a 3+ armor save means you need to roll a 3 or better on a dice if an armor save is needed. That way, the lower the better, because it increases your chances of rolling equal to or over that specific value. Now, this one really doesn't have an average value. For example, Space Marines, pretty much all across the board, they have 3-up armor saves or better, meaning they need to roll a 3 or better on a dice to save themselves. Some of you have 2-up armor saves. This Orc Boy, however, has a really bad armor. He has a 6+ armor save, meaning he needs to roll a 6+, so it's not very likely he's going to pass the save. If you inflict a wound on him, the odds are he is going to die. So in this particular case, the lower the better, and there really is no average value, I would say. Probably between 3 and 4, depending on which army you play. Some armies it's like 6, some armies it's 4, some armies it's 3. It's up to you based on the army you choose. And the final thing isn't really a part of the profile, it's not a value, but it's also what type of model is it? Is it an infantry model? Is it a beast? And it also says whether or not it is an independent character, and we'll be going over those in a future video. So that's about it covering the profile stat line. And then finally, we're just going to cover quickly on modifiers. Some things allow modifiers to modify the value of your stat line, such as ×2, +2, +1. And typically with modifiers, what you do is you multiply the weapon first and then add. So if your orc boy has a power claw and furious charge, which furious charge gives +1 to strength when he assaults in, first you multiply by 2, so strength 4 goes to strength 8, and then you add +1, so it goes to 9. It would not be vice versa, which would result in a value of 10. And there are also some weapons out there which set your specific value to a specific number. And if that's the case, that typically happens last. For example, certain weapons will drop your initiative to 1. And if that's the case, you don't add anything else. Typically after that, you just go directly to 1. There are only 2 values that can be raised above 10, and it is attacks and wounds. And typically these are done through extraneous circumstances that involve some combination of weapons. Worth mentioning that a model's initiative can never be dropped below a value of 1. It is always, the lowest it can be is 1. You cannot have an initiative value of 0. And no other characteristic can be modified below 0. So that's about it. So thank you so much for watching this episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th Edition. Now this is obviously a more brief episode covering the stat line of every model in 40K. And I hope this actually brings some clarity so you're not overwhelmed by this crazy stat line with a bunch of letters and numbers. I really hope I brought some light to it. So thank you so much for watching. Please stay tuned for the next video where I will talk about more about setting up the game of 40K and all the things that need to be considered before playing a game. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please stay tuned for more episodes. Till next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting.